Have you ever looked in the mirror and seen someone else's desperation staring back? I have. She has my face, my eyes, my DNA. And as I stood there, watching her, I knew she wanted something from me, something I was not willing to give. A mirror shows you your reflection, but what does it show when your reflection is a completely different person living a life you never wanted? My world is one of ordered silence, the satisfying heft of a leather-bound book, the low hum of a projector in a darkened lecture hall. As a professor of anthropology at Reed College, my life is measured in semesters and research grants. I dissect the rituals and kinship systems of ancient cultures, finding comfort in the logical frameworks that govern human behavior. My name is Olivia. I am 34 years old, and my body, my choices, my future, they belong to me. That morning, I was deep in the Amazon basin, metaphorically speaking. I was explaining moiety-based social structures to a class of engrossed undergraduates. The world outside the vaulted windows of the lecture hall, with its drizzling Portland sky, ceased to exist. Here, I was in control. Here, I was not a twin, not a sister, just a mind engaged in the work it loved. This was my sanctuary, a place built of facts and theories, a fortress against the messy, unpredictable tide of raw emotion. The drive to my older brother's house 2 hours later was like a journey to another planet. I left the quiet, cerebral world of academia and plunged into the vibrant, screaming chaos of my nephew Leo's 5th birthday party. The air, thick with the scent of sugar and cut grass, was a stark contrast to the familiar smell of old paper and dust in my office. Children, like a pack of brightly colored, shrieking animals, swarmed the backyard. This was the world my sister Chloe had always dreamed of. I saw her across the lawn, a fixed smile on her face, our face, the same high cheekbones, the same dark hair, the same gray eyes. But where my expression was one of detached observation, hers was a mask of exquisite pain. She was holding a brightly wrapped gift, but her gaze was locked on Leo as he tore open his presents. It wasn't just love in her eyes, it was a profound, bottomless hunger. Every happy shriek from a child was like a physical blow to her. She had always been the romantic, the dreamer. While I was diagramming the matrimonial rites of the Yanomami people, she was charting her ovulation cycles. Her life's singular ambition was to be a mother. For years, she and her husband Ben had been trying. They'd poured their savings, their hopes, and their very souls into the cold, clinical machinery of fertility treatments. Each failure chipped away another piece of her, leaving her more fragile, more desperate. I tried to stay on the periphery, making small talk with relatives who always did a double take, their brains struggling to process two identical faces on two vastly different women. "Olivia, you're looking great. Still happy with your books?" They'd ask, as if my career were a quaint hobby. I would smile and nod, feeling the invisible wall between us. They didn't understand my life any more than I could truly understand Chloe's all-consuming need. She finally cornered me by the back door, away from the noise. The forced brightness had fallen from her face, leaving behind a terrifying vulnerability. "Liv," she began, her voice barely a whisper, a sound I had known since before we were born. She didn't need to say more. I saw the answer in the way her shoulders slumped, in the slight tremor of her lower lip. My heart clenched in a familiar mix of sympathy and dread. How do you comfort someone whose greatest dream is your deepest ambivalence? "It didn't work," she whispered, and the words seemed to shatter the cheerful afternoon air. "The transfer failed. We did another round. It was the last of the embryos." I pulled her into a hug, her body feeling frail and bird-like in my arms. I could feel the rhythmic shudder of her silent sobs against my chest. I murmured empty comforts, the kind of things people say when there is nothing left to say. But the words felt like ash in my mouth. When she pulled back, her eyes, my eyes, were swimming in tears and something else. Something sharper, more intense. It was a look that pinned me in place. "The doctor called this morning," she said, her voice gaining a strange, fragile strength. "We had the follow-up. He told me it's over, Liv." She wasn't just telling me about a failed medical procedure. She was showing me the gaping hole in her life, a void shaped exactly like a child. And I felt a terrifying, cold certainty that she expected me to be the one to fill it. What is the sound of a dream dying? It's not a dramatic crash or a soul-wrenching scream. It's the silence in a car on the way home from a doctor's office. It's the click of a front door opening into a space that suddenly feels too empty. And, as I learned that Tuesday, it's the hollow tone of your identical twin's voice over the phone, asking if she and her husband can come over, using a tone that tells you something has been irrevocably broken. They arrived less than an hour later. I had been trying to lose myself in an article about mitochondrial DNA in matrilineal societies, but the words blurred into meaningless symbols. My apartment, usually a haven of quiet order, felt like a waiting room. I watched them get out of the car from my window. Ben, ever the stoic protector, had his arm around Chloe's shoulders, but he looked smaller, diminished. Chloe was a specter, her movements slow and disconnected, as if she were navigating a world that was no longer hers. When I opened the door, the air crackled with unspoken tragedy. We dispensed with the usual greetings. I just stepped aside and let them in. They sat on my couch, a piece of furniture I'd chosen for its clean, modern lines, and they seemed to sink into it. Two figures drowning in a sea of beige fabric. Ben held her hand, his knuckles white. Chloe stared at a point on my wall, right past a framed print of a Malian fertility idol. The irony so thick I could barely breathe. "He gave us the final results," Ben said, his voice raspy. He was always the spokesperson when Chloe's emotions overwhelmed her. "We went in this morning for the follow-up, after the last cycle failed. The doctor." He was very direct. He paused, searching for the right words. But there are no right words for this kind of devastation. How do you package a life sentence into a polite, manageable conversation? You can't. It will always be brutal. Chloe finally spoke, her voice a fragile, papery thing. "Premature ovarian failure." She said the words like a foreign phrase she'd been forced to memorize, a clinical label for a deeply personal hell. That's what he called it. He said my eggs. He used the word unviable, like spoiled fruit. Something you throw away. A single tear traced a path down her cheek, a journey I could feel on my own skin. It was a strange phantom sensation unique to being a twin, an echo of her pain in my own nerve endings. My mind, the traitorous analytical part of me, immediately began to process the data. I knew the term. A rare condition, statistically improbable, cruelly random. A biological lottery where my sister had drawn the losing ticket. While she saw the end of her world, I saw a cellular malfunction, a genetic misfire. It was a defense mechanism I knew, this retreat into intellectualization. It was the only way I could sit there and not completely fracture alongside her. He said there are no more options for us, not with my own material, she continued, her voice cracking on the last word. No more hormones, no more procedures. He said to continue would be pointless, medically futile. She looked at me then, her gaze desperate, pleading for me to offer a different conclusion, to use my academic mind to find a loophole in the biological contract. But I had nothing. Anthropology can explain the human obsession with lineage, but it cannot reverse the cellular decay of an ovary. Ben squeezed her hand tighter. The doctor did mention one path. The only path, if we want Chloe to carry a child. He looked from her to me, and I felt a cold dread begin to pool in my stomach. I knew what was coming. I had known, on some subconscious level, since the moment she called. What if I told you that the most generous act one person can perform for another can also be the most terrifying demand? A donor egg, Chloe whispered, and the phrase hung in the air between us, heavy and toxic. For her, it was a word of profound loss. A donor meant a stranger. It meant a child that was Ben's, but not hers. A cuckoo in the nest of her own body. It was the ultimate failure in her eyes, a complete erasure of her genetic legacy. She wanted her child, a miniature fusion of herself and the man she loved. And in the sterile, quiet atmosphere of my apartment, I saw the logic of her despair unfold. There was only one person in the world who could give her that. What if I told you that the most dangerous weapon in the world isn't a gun or a bomb, but a memory? A half-forgotten promise made by a child, unearthed at the perfect moment, and polished until it shines like a blade. That's what happened that Sunday. The family gathered at my parents' house, a place so steeped in our shared history that the very walls seemed to hold their breath, waiting for the past to erupt. The air was thick with a carefully managed sorrow. My mother called it a family dinner to rally around Chloe, but it felt more like a wake for a future that would never be born. Chloe sat on the sofa, a fragile doll wrapped in a cashmere blanket, while my mother hovered, refilling a teacup that Chloe never touched. My father made a clumsy attempt at small talk about the weather, his voice unnaturally loud in the funereal quiet. Ben just stood by the fireplace, his hands shoved in his pockets, a sentry guarding the epicenter of our collective grief. I felt like an anthropologist observing a foreign tribe's mourning ritual. I was a participant, yet utterly separate. My grief was for my sister's pain, but theirs was a tangled, communal agony over the absence of a hypothetical child. They looked at me with a strange mixture of pity and expectation, as if I, the other half of the whole, held some secret key to fixing this. The unspoken question hung in the air, more oppressive than the scent of my mother's roast chicken. What are you going to do about it? We moved to the dining table, the silence punctuated by the clinking of silverware. Then, my mother, her face etched with a desperate, problem-solving brightness, set down a platter of asparagus. "You know," she began, her voice taking on a wistful, storytelling tone. "It's funny what you remember. I was thinking about that summer, the one when you girls were 12. You basically lived in that old treehouse." She smiled, a soft, unfocused look in her eyes as she dredged the past for a life raft. I knew the summer she meant. The one that smelled of cut grass and bubblegum. The one where we read fantasy novels and believed in magic. "Girls, do you remember your silly blood oath?" she continued, oblivious to the grenade she was about to roll onto the table. "You came inside with these tiny little pinpricks on your thumbs, so serious, and told me you'd made a pact. You called it, oh, what was it? The fertility pact." She laughed lightly, a sound that grated against my raw nerves. I froze, a fork halfway to my mouth. Of course I remembered. How could I forget? A humid August afternoon, 22 years ago. We'd used a needle from Mom's sewing kit, sterilized with a match, and pressed our bleeding thumbs together. We swore that we would always share everything, that if one of us couldn't have something, the other would give it to her. And in the dramatic, high-stakes world of 12-year-old girls, we had specifically included children in our list of shareable assets. A stupid, childish game, a meaningless piece of personal history. But in the suffocating silence of that dining room, her words were not a fond reminiscence. They were an accusation, a proposal, a verdict. I watched the realization dawn on everyone's faces. My father stopped chewing. Ben looked up from his plate, his eyes widening. The memory, unearthed and presented in the context of Chloe's barren diagnosis, was no longer innocent. It had been weaponized. And then I saw it. I saw the shift in my sister. She slowly lifted her head, and the dull, vacant misery in her eyes was replaced by a sudden, terrifying flicker of hope. It was a raw, desperate, grasping hope, the kind you see in a drowning person's eyes when they spot a piece of driftwood. She didn't say a word. She didn't have to. She just looked at me. Her eyes, my eyes, locked onto mine, and in their depths, the childish promise echoed with the full force of an adult demand. "You swore." Her gaze screamed at me across the polished mahogany table. "You swore you would help me." The silence in the car on the way back to my apartment was a living thing. It was a thick, suffocating blanket woven from my sister's desperate hope and my own rising panic. The memory of that childish pact, so casually resurrected by my mother, now sat between us, a ticking bomb. It had been 22 years. Did a promise made by a 12-year-old have a statute of limitations? Apparently not. Not when it was the only thing my sister had left to cling to. 2 days later, they came to my apartment. Chloe and Ben. They didn't call first. They didn't need to. This was not a social visit. This was a delegation. They sat on my couch, the same spot where Chloe had confessed her diagnosis. But their energy was different now. The raw, directionless grief had been replaced by a focused, terrifying sense of purpose. Her eyes, which had been dull with despair, now held a feverish light. She was a missionary who had found her one true faith, and she was here to convert me. "Live," Chloe began, her hands clasped so tightly in her lap that her knuckles were white. She leaned forward, her voice a low, intimate murmur, as if she were sharing a sacred secret. "We've been talking, Ben and I, about what Mom said, about our promise." She looked at me, her gaze impossibly heavy. I know it was a silly kid thing, but maybe it wasn't. Maybe it was fate. Don't you see? All these years you've had no desire for children, and I've wanted nothing else. It's like the universe balanced it out between us. It makes perfect sense. Here it was. The moment my academic brain had been dreading, the one where raw emotion attempts to disguise itself as logic. I took a slow, deliberate breath, trying to anchor myself in the world of facts. "Chloe," I said, keeping my voice as gentle, as clinical as I could. "I hear you. I understand why it feels like a perfect solution, but it's not that simple. We're not talking about lending you a book or a sweater. This is a major medical intervention." I was trying to build a wall of reason, brick by rational brick. "We need to be realistic about what this would entail," I continued, pressing on before she could interrupt. "It would mean weeks of hormone injections for me, powerful drugs designed to shut down my own cycle and then hyperstimulate my ovaries to produce a large number of eggs. It's not a simple process, and it has significant side effects." I could see her expression starting to harden. My facts were an inconvenience to her beautiful, simple narrative of sisterly sacrifice. I had to make her see. "And the retrieval itself. It's an invasive surgical procedure, Chloe. It requires anesthesia. There are risks. Ovarian hyperstimulation syndrome, which can be very serious. And we don't even have comprehensive data on the long-term effects for donors." I leaned forward, trying to meet her gaze, trying to appeal to the sister who, somewhere deep down, must still care about my well-being. "This is my body. It's an enormous decision, with consequences I would have to live with forever." The wall of reason crumbled before it was even built. "Consequences?" she asked, her voice rising with a sharp edge of disbelief. She laughed, a short, bitter sound devoid of humor. You're talking to me about consequences? I'm living the consequences, Liv. Every single day. A few weeks of shots and feeling bloated. That's your consequence? You weigh that against a lifetime of childlessness for me? She looked at Ben, who gave a slight, affirming nod, his silence a heavy weight of agreement. And then she stood up, her body trembling with a sudden, violent surge of emotion. The quiet desperation was gone, replaced by a righteous fury that was terrifying to behold. Her voice, when she spoke again, was no longer a plea. It was a raw, wounded cry of accusation. "Your body?" she shrieked, the two words echoing in the quiet room. "Don't talk to me about your body. We have the same body. We have the same face. For our entire lives, people haven't been able to tell us apart. You are my only chance. My only chance on this earth to have a child that is mine, and you're quoting medical journals at me? How can you be so selfish? How can you do this to me? How do you say no to your entire family? It's not one decision, but 1,000 tiny battles fought over phone calls, during tense visits, and in the silence of your own home." After Chloe's outburst, a new phase of the campaign began. It was a strategy of attrition, designed to wear me down, to make my resistance seem not just selfish, but irrational and cold-hearted. The new family mantra became, "Just go for a consultation. What's the harm in just talking to the doctor?" It was a brilliant tactic. Arguing against just talking made me sound unreasonable, hysterical even. My mother would call, her voice syrupy with concern. "Olivia, honey, I know this is a lot, but Dr. Albright is the best. All Chloe is asking is for you to go with her, to hear what he has to say, just to get the facts. For your sister. Can't you do that one small thing for her?" Each sentence was a carefully placed stone, building a prison of guilt around me. Ben would send texts. "Chloe isn't sleeping. She just wants you to be informed. Please live." I knew it was a trap. I, a woman whose entire career was built on research and objective analysis, was being lured into a situation where objectivity was impossible. They didn't want me to get facts. They wanted me to be persuaded. They wanted an expert in a white coat to dismantle my arguments and soothe my fears until my no softened into a maybe, and then, inevitably, a yes. Against my better judgment, worn down by the constant, gentle pressure, I agreed. What harm could there be in just listening? I told myself it would be an opportunity to ask the hard questions, to have a medical professional validate my concerns. I was a fool. The reproductive clinic was an exercise in calculated serenity. Soft lighting, muted colors, abstract art on the walls. It was designed to feel like a spa, a place of hope and quiet miracles, not a medical facility where bodies were drugged, manipulated, and harvested. We sat in the waiting room, Chloe, Ben, and I, a tableau of forced calm. Chloe was vibrating with a nervous energy, her leg jiggling a frantic rhythm against the plush armchair. I felt a cold detachment, as if I were observing this scene from behind a one-way mirror. Dr. Albright was exactly what you'd expect. He had silver hair, a reassuring smile, and a voice that was both authoritative and kind. He greeted Chloe and Ben with the warm familiarity of a long-trusted ally, then turned that same warmth on me. "Olivia, it's a pleasure to meet you. Your sister has told me so much about you. What you're considering doing? It's an incredibly generous act." The trap was sprung before I'd even had a chance to speak. He had already framed my presence not as an inquiry, but as the first step toward a foregone conclusion. We sat in his office with its mahogany desk and framed photos of smiling babies. He launched into his presentation, a smooth, practiced monologue. He spoke of the egg donation process not as a medical procedure, but as a gift, a noble, beautiful gift of life. Think of it this way: he said, his eyes twinkling. You're giving your sister the most profound gift one woman can give another. He used words like elegant, straightforward, and routine. He made it sound as simple as giving blood. When I tried to interject, to ask about the risks I'd read about, he waved them away with a gentle, paternalistic smile. Of course, every medical procedure has minor risks, Olivia. We'll give you a pamphlet. But let me reassure you, this is a standard, safe process we perform every single day. The side effects, some bloating, a bit of moodiness from the hormones, are temporary and minimal for the vast majority of women. He looked directly at Chloe, whose face was illuminated with relief. He was her priest, absolving her of the sin of asking for my sacrifice. He saw his patient, Chloe. He saw her years of pain, her bottomless desperation. His goal, his entire professional purpose, was to get her pregnant. I was not his patient. I was a means to an end, an obstacle to be managed, a resource to be cultivated. Every concern I raised was reframed as a minor inconvenience in the face of my sister's monumental suffering. He was not a neutral arbiter of facts. He was an advocate for Chloe's dream, and I was being cast as the villain who stood in its way. I felt the walls of the trap closing in. I had come seeking an ally in science and reason, and instead, I had been delivered into the hands of my family's most powerful accomplice. Have you ever felt like a ghost in your own life? That's what started to happen after the consultation with Dr. Albright. My refusal to immediately surrender was no longer seen as a rational decision about my own health, but as a moral failing. The visit that was supposed to inform me had simply armed my family with a new weapon, the veneer of medical authority. Now, their pleas were laced with Dr. Albright's soothing, dismissive rhetoric. But the doctor said it was perfectly safe, my mother would chirp over the phone. He said the side effects were minimal. My own body became a battleground, and I was losing control. The most insidious part of their campaign was the constant, relentless emphasis on our identical nature. My physical being, the very vessel of my existence, was being rhetorically confiscated. Every conversation was a subtle reminder that my body was not truly my own. It was a shared asset, a biological resource that I was selfishly hoarding. My own face, reflected in a shop window or a bathroom mirror, became a source of profound unease. I didn't see Olivia anymore. I saw Chloe's pain, Chloe's hope, Chloe's demand. My mother was the chief propagandist of this twisted logic. It's not like she's asking a stranger, she explained to my aunt over the phone one afternoon, in a conversation I was clearly meant to overhear. They're identical. The DNA is the same. It's almost as if Chloe were helping herself. Olivia just has the working parts. The working parts. I was being reduced to a set of functional ovaries, a walking, talking incubator for my sister's dream. My intellect, my career, my entire identity as a separate, autonomous human being, it was all being erased. The psychological pressure was immense, a slow, crushing weight. I would be getting ready for work, looking in the mirror to apply mascara, and suddenly be struck by a wave of dissociation. Whose eyes am I decorating? Whose face is this? The boundary between me and her, a line I had spent my entire life carefully drawing, was being systematically blurred by the people who were supposed to love us both. They used our shared genetics as the ultimate argument, a biological trump card that invalidated all of my feelings and concerns. One evening, my father, a man who usually avoided emotional conflict, cornered me in the kitchen. "Liv," he said, his voice heavy with a weary sort of sadness. "I look at you, and I see her. I look at her, and I see you. You girls have shared everything since the day you were born. A bedroom, toys, sicknesses. You even got the chicken pox on the same day, remember? This is no different. It's just one more thing to share. He truly believed it. He saw no distinction between sharing a childhood illness and undergoing an invasive medical procedure. This constant refrain, "You're the same, you're identical, it's like helping yourself," was a form of psychological warfare. It was designed to make me feel insane for even wanting a boundary. My body, which had always been a source of strength and independence, now felt like evidence in a trial where I was the defendant. My very existence, my healthy, fertile body, was a constant walking reproach to my sister. My physical similarity to her was being used to erase my personhood, transforming me from an individual into a solution. And the scariest part was, it was starting to work. I began to feel a creeping, monstrous guilt every time I looked in the mirror. What happens when the story you're being told feels fundamentally wrong? You start looking for the footnotes. You start searching for the primary sources. For weeks, I had been living in a fog of emotional blackmail, my own instincts drowned out by a chorus of voices telling me what I should feel, what I should do. They had their expert, Dr. Albright. They had their narrative of the noble gift. But my soul, the rational, evidence-based core of me, was screaming that I was missing half the story. So I did the only thing I knew how to do. I began my own research. As an anthropologist, my work is to listen to the stories people tell, to find the truth in the unfiltered human experience. I wasn't going to find it in the glossy pamphlets from the clinic. The truth lived elsewhere. My laptop became my sanctuary and my weapon. Late at night, after the phone calls had stopped and the house was quiet, I descended into the digital world, a world beyond my family's influence. I didn't search for medical journals at first. I searched for people. I found them in password-protected forums with names like Donor Perspectives and Egg Donor Sisters. I found them in anonymous blogs written in the stark, confessional language of 3 a.m. desperation. These were the women who had been in my position. These were the women who had said yes. And their stories, raw and unvarnished, were nothing like the sanitized fairy tale Dr. Albright had spun for me. My clinical detachment dissolved within the first hour. I read about the daily injections, not as a minor inconvenience, but as a physically and emotionally grueling ordeal. Women described the relentless bloating that made them look 5 months pregnant, the bruising that covered their abdomens, the hormone-fueled mood swings that left them weeping on the bathroom floor. They talked about the constant dull ache in their ovaries, a feeling of being overripe, stretched to the breaking point. This wasn't a gift. It was a physical siege. Then I found the stories about ovarian hyperstimulation syndrome. Dr. Albright had dismissed it as a minor risk. These women described it as a living hell. They wrote about lungs filling with fluid, making it impossible to breathe. They wrote of terrifying blood clots, of weeks spent in the hospital, of bodies so swollen and in pain they couldn't recognize themselves. One woman, a 26-year-old from Ohio, described the experience as feeling like her insides were being twisted into knots by an invisible hand. The further I dug, the darker it became. I found the hushed, anxious conversations about the long-term consequences, the ones Dr. Albright had conveniently forgotten to mention. The disquieting lack of comprehensive longitudinal studies on donors, the whispers of a potential link to certain cancers, of premature menopause, of future fertility problems. I was being asked to gamble with my own future health, and the people pushing me to do it had hidden the fact that no one even knew the true odds. But the most devastating truths were not medical, they were emotional. I read dozens of stories from women who had donated to their sisters or cousins, only to have the relationship shatter under the weight of the gift. They wrote of the psychological trauma of seeing a child with their own eyes and hair, a child that was genetically theirs but would never call them mother. They wrote of the unbearable holidays, the unspoken resentments, the way their noble act became a debt that could never be repaid, poisoning the very love it was meant to celebrate. By the time the sun began to filter through my blinds, I was shaking. Not from fear, but from a cold, clear rage. It wasn't just that they had downplayed the risks. They had lied. It was a lie of omission, a carefully curated version of the truth designed to manipulate me into compliance. The stories I read were not footnotes. They were the entire text. And they confirmed the one, simple truth my own body had been screaming at me all along. I was not being selfish. I was being sane. Do you know the difference between rage and clarity? Rage is a hot, blinding storm. Clarity is a cold, single point of light in the darkness. After a sleepless night spent in the trenches of other women's truths, I was no longer angry. I was dangerously clear. The fog of guilt and obligation had burned away, leaving behind a hard, crystalline certainty. I had my evidence. I had my answer. And there would be no more discussion. I summoned them for a final meeting at my apartment. My parents, Chloe and Ben. I needed to do this on my own territory, a neutral ground that hadn't been contaminated by their grief or my childhood memories. As they filed in, their faces were a mixture of cautious optimism and nervous anticipation. They thought I had finally come around. They thought my research had led me to their foregone conclusion. They had no idea they were walking into an execution. I didn't offer them drinks. I didn't engage in small talk. I remained standing while they awkwardly arranged themselves on my couch. I held a single sheet of paper in my hand, though I didn't need it. The words were etched into my brain. "Thank you all for coming," I began, my voice steady, devoid of the emotion that had choked me for weeks. "I've done what you asked. I've gotten informed. I have researched this process extensively, beyond the pamphlet Dr. Albright provided, and I have made my final decision." I let the words hang in the air, a moment of pure, unadulterated power. I saw a flicker of doubt in my mother's eyes. Chloe leaned forward, her hands gripping her knees. "My answer," I said, looking directly at my sister, "is no. It is unequivocally, absolutely, and permanently no. I will not be a donor. Not now, not ever. This discussion is over." The silence that followed was absolute, a perfect vacuum. It was the sound of a dream hitting a brick wall at 100 miles per hour. Chloe was the first to break. It wasn't a cry of sadness. It was a gasp of pure, uncomprehending shock. "No?" she whispered, the word a tiny, fragile thing. What do you mean, no?" "We went to the doctor. He said it was safe." I was ready for this. The doctor lied by omission, Chloe. He presented a curated, best-case scenario because you are his patient and his goal is to get you pregnant. He failed to mention the significant risk of ovarian hyperstimulation syndrome, the lack of long-term studies on donors, and the profound psychological trauma many women experience. I calmly laid out the facts, my voice the dispassionate tone of a lecturer. I spoke of the fluid in the lungs, the blood clots, the destroyed relationships I'd read about. With every sentence, I watched the hope drain from their faces, replaced by a rising tide of disbelief and fury. My mother started to cry softly. My father just stared at me, his face pale. "This isn't about not wanting to help you," I said, my voice softening for just a moment. "It's about my fundamental right to bodily autonomy, my right to say no to a procedure that puts my health and my future at risk." That was when the dam broke. The carefully constructed facade of a loving, concerned family collapsed into raw, ugly desperation. "Bodily autonomy?" Chloe screamed, leaping to her feet. You stand there and you talk about your rights. You are killing my baby, the only baby I will ever have. It's right there, inside you, and you're keeping it from me. You are a monster. My mother rushed to her side, murmuring, "Shh, shh, Chloe." But her eyes, when they met mine, were filled with a cold, hard judgment. "How can you be so heartless, Olivia?" she whispered. But it was Ben, quiet, steady Ben, who delivered the final devastating blow. He hadn't moved from his seat, but his face had become a hard, unrecognizable mask. He looked at me, his eyes filled not with anger, but with a terrifying, cold finality. "I love my wife," he said, his voice dangerously low. "Her happiness is the only thing that matters. If she doesn't get this child, if you deny her this one chance, I don't know if our marriage will survive the grief. And if it doesn't," he paused, letting the weight of his words settle on me, "that will be on your conscience for the rest of your life." There are two kinds of silence. The first is the silence of peace, the quiet hum of a library, or the stillness of a forest. The second is the silence of a battlefield after the last bomb has dropped, a cold, heavy vacuum where all connection has been severed. In the week following the ultimatum, my family subjected me to the second kind. My phone stopped ringing. My inbox remained empty. I was an island, excommunicated from the archipelago of our shared history. I told myself I didn't care. I reveled in the quiet. I poured my energy into my work, seeking refuge in the cool, rational world of academia. My office, with its towering shelves of books and the faint scent of old paper, was a fortress. Here, the chaos of my family could not touch me. Here, I was not a twin or a daughter. I was Professor Evans, an expert in cultural kinship, a respected mind. I was safe. What a profoundly dangerous illusion that turned out to be. The attack came on a Tuesday afternoon, a day that had been perfectly, beautifully ordinary. It arrived not as a shout, but as a whisper. A single email from Dr. Wallace, the Dean of the Faculty of Arts and Sciences. The subject line was simply, "Meeting." The body was just one sentence. "Olivia, could you please stop by my office at 3 this afternoon?" There was no explanation, no context, just a polite, professional summons that landed in my stomach like a block of ice. My mind raced through a dozen logical possibilities: a problem with my tenure application, a last-minute change to the semester's course schedule, a complaint from a disgruntled student. Each possibility was unpleasant but manageable, belonging to the orderly world of professional life. The one possibility that never once crossed my mind was that the war I thought was being fought in living rooms and over phone lines had just breached the walls of my fortress. At precisely 3 o'clock, I knocked on the dean's heavy oak door. Dr. Wallace was a kind, slightly rumpled man in his late 60s, a historian who valued decorum and process above all else. He was the last person on earth you would expect to be drawn into a messy family drama. He gestured for me to sit, his usual warm smile replaced by a look of profound discomfort. He cleared his throat, shuffled some papers on his desk, and avoided my eyes. "Olivia," he began, his voice low and cautious. Well, I received a rather unusual phone call this morning, from a woman who identified herself as your sister Chloe." My blood ran cold. It felt as if the floor had dropped away, leaving me suspended in a state of pure, sickening shock. This was impossible. This was a line that couldn't be crossed. It was a violation of the most sacred rules of engagement. I could only stare at him, my throat too tight to form words. He continued, clearly pained. She was extremely upset. Hysterical, I would say. She spoke at length about a very sensitive family medical issue. He looked up at me, his eyes full of a pained, apologetic confusion. Frankly, I tried to end the conversation several times, but she was insistent. She kept saying that you were refusing to save her life. He let that phrase hang in the air, a piece of toxic radioactive material contaminating the sterile environment of his office. The implication was clear. Chloe had not accused me of being a bad professor. She had done something far more insidious. Crying, screaming, she had painted a picture of me as a cruel, vindictive, and mentally unstable person. Someone so cold and unfeeling that I would watch my own twin die rather than help. It was a brilliant, devastating act of sabotage. It was an attack aimed not at my actions, but at the very foundation of my professional identity. My reputation as a stable, rational, and compassionate human being. In that moment, I realized the war was not over. It had just entered a terrifying new phase, one for which there were no rules at all. For a long moment, I couldn't process the words. My professional world, a space I had meticulously constructed to be safe, rational, and immune to the emotional chaos of my family, had just been breached by a tactical nuclear strike. I sat there, in the plush guest chair opposite the dean's desk, and all I could hear was a high-pitched ringing in my ears. The man before me wasn't just my boss. He was a gatekeeper to my future, a key figure in my tenure review. And my sister, in an act of breathtaking desperation, had just painted me as a monster in front of him. I opened my mouth to defend myself, to explain the years of IVF, the diagnosis, the medical risks, the emotional blackmail. The words formed in my mind, a frantic, logical cascade of facts and evidence. But what came out was a strangled whisper. That is a profound mischaracterization of a private matter. It was the weakest, most pathetically academic sentence I had ever uttered. I felt the hot flush of shame creep up my neck. I was a professor of anthropology, an expert in human social dynamics, and I had been reduced to a stammering child in the principal's office. But then, something unexpected happened. Dean Wallace held up a hand, a gesture not of dismissal, but of gentle interruption. "Olivia," he said, and for the first time he met my eyes directly. The look on his face wasn't judgment or professional concern. It was a deep, weary sadness. "You don't need to explain the details to me. It's not my business, and frankly, I shouldn't have been put in this position." He sighed, leaning back in his leather chair which groaned in protest. "I'm not telling you this as your dean. I'm telling you because the pain in your sister's voice. It was a sound I recognized." He paused, looking at a framed photo on his desk. "My wife, Eleanor, and we tried for a child for almost a decade. This was back in the 80s, before all the advanced procedures they have now. We went through everything. The hope, the failure, the silence in the house after another negative test. It nearly broke us. It nearly broke her." He spoke in a quiet, even tone, but I could hear the echo of an old, deep pain in his voice. He wasn't telling me a story to make me feel better. He was showing me a scar. "Desperate people do desperate things, Olivia," he continued, his gaze still on the photograph. "People in that kind of pain, they lose perspective. They stop seeing the people around them as people, and start seeing them as either obstacles or solutions. I have no doubt your sister loves you, but right now, she's drowning. And drowning people will pull anyone under with them if they think it will get them 1 inch closer to the surface." His words hit me with the force of a physical blow. He understood. He actually, truly understood the impossible dynamic I was trapped in. For the first time in months, I felt something other than rage or terror. It was a crack in the icy wall of my isolation, a single warming ray of external validation. I wasn't a monster. I wasn't a cold-hearted villain. I was just the person standing too close to someone who was drowning. I left his office 20 minutes later in a daze, the professional crisis somehow overshadowed by this profound, unexpected moment of human connection. The shame was gone, replaced by a cold, hard resolve. Chloe had tried to define me, to write my story in the darkest possible terms. Now it was my turn to pick up the pen. I walked back to my office, but I didn't see the familiar hallways or the students milling about. I saw a battlefield. I saw that my strategy of hiding, of keeping the war contained within the family, had failed catastrophically. The silence wasn't protecting me. It was enabling the abuse, allowing their narrative to become the only one. I sat down at my desk, my hands trembling slightly. I opened my laptop, but instead of my lecture notes, I opened a new browser tab. I found a private blogging platform, a community forum for discussions on ethics and family. I created an anonymous account. And then I began to write. It started as a trickle, then became a flood. I wrote everything: the pact, the diagnosis, the pressure, the mirror, the doctor, the ultimatum, the phone call. I poured the entire sordid, heartbreaking story onto the screen, not as a plea for help, but as a testimony, an act of defiance, a declaration that I existed, separate from her, and my story deserved to be told. What is the sound of 1,000 strangers whispering your secret back to you? It's the click of a keyboard, the soft glow of a screen in a dark room. After hitting publish on that anonymous blog post, I felt a terrifying, exhilarating release. I had taken my private agony and hurled it into the void. For a full hour, I didn't look. I was too afraid of the response I expected. Silence. Or worse, judgment. I had exposed the ugliest parts of my family, and I braced myself for the condemnation of strangers. But when I finally forced myself to look, it wasn't silence that greeted me. It was a roar. The post, which I had titled "The Identical Sacrifice," had been shared, and then shared again. The comment count, which I had expected to be 0, was 23. An hour later, it was over 100. By the next morning, it was in the thousands. My story, my specific, unique, and lonely hell, had become a beacon, and people were flocking to it from all over the world, leaving a trail of digital breadcrumbs that all said the same thing: you are not alone. I spent the next 48 hours in a fugue state, glued to my screen, scrolling through an endless river of validation. The comments came from everywhere. A woman in Australia who had refused to be a surrogate for her sister and hadn't spoken to her in 5 years. A man in England whose wife was pressuring his sister for an egg. A young woman in California in the middle of the donation process for her cousin, who was now having second thoughts. They weren't just offering sympathy, they were sharing their own stories, creating a tapestry of shared experience that was breathtaking in its scope. For the first time, I wasn't just Olivia Evans, the selfish twin. I was part of a silent, invisible army of women who had been asked to sacrifice their bodies on the altar of someone else's dream. My inbox overflowed with private messages, hundreds of them. Each one was a confession, a cry for help, or a story of survival. "Thank you for writing this," one said. "I said no to my best friend 2 years ago, and I've felt like a monster ever since. Tonight, for the first time, I don't." My research had given me the facts. These women were giving me back my soul. But in the midst of this overwhelming flood of support, one message stood out. It had a simple, stark subject line: from a sister who said yes. My hand trembled as I clicked on it. The message was short, just a few paragraphs, written with a clarity that could only have been forged in the fires of a profound regret. The anonymous user, Jane Doe 3, didn't waste time on platitudes. She went straight to the heart of it, her words precise and devastating. "I read your story and I felt like I was reading a letter from my younger self," she wrote. "My sister couldn't have children. I was her identical twin. I had the working parts. I heard all the same arguments you did. I went to the same kind of doctor. I believed in the noble gift. So I did it. I gave her my eggs. She has a beautiful 4-year-old daughter now. A daughter with my eyes and my smile, who will never know that half of her DNA came from the sad, quiet aunt who can barely stand to be in the same room with her. She wrote about the complications she'd had, a severe case of OHSS that left her hospitalized for 2 weeks and with potential long-term fertility issues. But the physical pain, she wrote, was nothing compared to the emotional wreckage. My gift destroyed us, the message continued. She sees me as a means to an end. I see her daughter and feel a grief so profound I can't breathe. Every family gathering is a performance. We are no longer sisters. We are a transaction that went wrong. Then came the final 2 sentences, the words that would become my mantra, my shield, my unshakable truth. They will tell you this is about love. They are wrong. Do not do this. Real love does not require you to set yourself on fire to keep someone else warm. Real love does not require you to set yourself on fire to keep someone else warm. That sentence, from the anonymous woman who had walked this path before me, had rewired my brain. It was no longer a matter of opinion or debate. It was a physical law, as true and unyielding as gravity. You cannot build a life on the ashes of another. For days, those words were my shield and my compass, and they guided me toward the one final act that I knew I had to perform. It would not be an argument. It would be an offering. I spent an entire evening curating the evidence. Not my evidence, but theirs. I sat at my desk, the glow of the screen illuminating the faces of hundreds of women I would never meet. I carefully selected about 20 stories from the blog comments and my private messages. I chose the most visceral, the most honest. I printed the story of the woman from Ohio who described OHSS as being twisted from the inside out. I printed the story of the sister who became a stranger to her own genetic child. I printed every raw, painful, unvarnished word until I had a stack of paper nearly an inch thick. The next morning, I placed the stack of papers into a simple, plain manila folder. It felt impossibly heavy in my hands, weighted with the accumulated pain of strangers. There were no charts, no medical jargon, no academic arguments. It was just a collection of human souls, pressed flat between sheets of paper. This was my last letter to my sister, and it had been written by a chorus of ghosts. As I drove toward her house, the same route that had once filled me with a sickening dread, I felt a strange and profound calm. I was not going to a fight. I was going to a funeral, the funeral for a childish pact that had grown into a monster. She opened the door and I saw her flinch, her body instantly tensing for another battle. She looked exhausted, her face pale and drawn, but her eyes, my eyes, were hard with resentment. "What do you want, Olivia?" she asked, her voice a brittle shard of glass. She didn't invite me in. We stood on her doorstep, the gray Oregon sky pressing down on us, a gulf as wide as a canyon between us. This was the moment. The final scene in a play that had gone on for far too long. I didn't answer her question directly. I didn't try to argue or explain. I simply held out the heavy folder. She stared at it, her brow furrowed in suspicion. She probably thought it was more research, another collection of facts and statistics to counter her feelings. She didn't move to take it. "I'm not here to fight with you, Chloe," I said, my voice softer than I expected, stripped of all its previous anger and defensiveness. "I'm done fighting. I'm done trying to make you understand my position." I pushed the folder gently toward her until her fingers finally, reluctantly, closed around it. "These are not my words," I said, looking her directly in the eye, willing her to see past her own pain for just 1 second. They're the words of other women, other sisters. I took a small step back, creating a space between us, a final, necessary separation. I had built my walls, I had defended my territory, and now I was going to give her one last chance to see the world from outside her own despair. "Read this," I said, and my voice was almost a whisper. "Please, just read it. Not as a woman who wants a child. Read it as my sister. My sister, who, I hope, still loves me somewhere under all of this pain." And with that, I turned and walked away. I did not wait for a response. I did not look back to see the expression on her face. I walked down the suburban sidewalk, past the manicured lawns and the houses filled with the families she so desperately craved, and I did not look back. I left her standing in the doorway, holding a folder full of other people's sorrow. The responsibility was no longer mine. I was not her enemy, not her savior, not her solution. I was her sister. And I had just given her the only thing I had left to give, the unvarnished, heartbreaking truth. I got in my car and drove away, with no sense of victory, only a profound and aching grief for the two little girls who had once pressed their bleeding thumbs together, never imagining the terrible price of their promise. What's the true definition of silence? For 3 months, I learned it wasn't the absence of sound, but the presence of an unanswered question. After I left that folder on her doorstep, the war ended. The phone calls, the pressure, the ambient hum of my family's collective disappointment. It all stopped. But peace did not rush in to fill the void. Instead, a new kind of quiet settled over my life, a heavy, uncertain stillness. We were two planets that had been knocked out of their shared orbit, now spinning alone in the cold, dark vacuum of what had been said and what had been done. I didn't reach out. My final act had been to hand the truth to her, and the next move had to be hers. I went to work. I wrote my lectures. I graded papers. I lived my life with a determined, almost aggressive normalcy. But her absence was a phantom limb, a space at the table I could still feel. I would catch myself looking in the mirror and, for a split second, be surprised to see only myself looking back. The feeling of being a vessel, a resource, had faded, leaving behind the faint, ghostly outline of a battle won at a terrible cost. The email arrived on a Saturday in early May, a day when the sun had finally broken through the persistent Oregon clouds. The sender was simply Chloe. There was no subject line. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage. For a moment, I couldn't bring myself to open it. Was this it? Round 2? A new line of attack? A final blistering condemnation? My finger hovered over the trackpad, my mind bracing for impact. I finally clicked, my breath held tight in my chest. The body of the email contained no text. There were no accusations, no apologies, no words at all. There was only a single, unadorned hyperlink. It was a link to a blog, a simple, clean design with a title that made my throat tighten. An unexpected path. I clicked, my curiosity overriding my fear. The blog was hers. The profile picture was a recent one of her and Ben, standing on a beach, the wind in their hair. They were smiling. It wasn't the strained, desperate smile I had grown so used to seeing. It was a real smile, one that reached their eyes. I started reading from the first post, dated about 6 weeks earlier. It began as a raw, unfiltered journal of her grief. She wrote about the anger, the jealousy, the profound, hollow ache of an empty womb. She wrote about her rage at the world, at her own body. And she wrote about her rage at me. It was painful to read, but I couldn't stop. I was finally seeing the uncensored landscape of her despair, the storm I had only ever seen from the outside. But as I read on, post by post, I witnessed a slow, seismic shift. She wrote about the day I had come to her door. She wrote about opening the folder, about her initial impulse to throw it in the trash. But she had read it. She described staying up all night, reading the stories of those anonymous women, and how with each story, a layer of her own righteous anger had peeled away, revealing something tender and raw beneath. She wrote about seeing, for the very first time, that the world did not revolve solely around her pain. The final post, the one published that very morning, was the one that broke me. It was titled, "A Different Kind of Family." She wrote that after weeks of talking, really talking, she and Ben had attended an orientation for foster care and adoption. A new hope had taken root in their lives, a hope that was not about genetics or biology, but about love. And then, at the very end, she wrote the words that finally, definitively, ended our war. "For years, I believed my happiness depended on a single outcome," she wrote, "and I was willing to burn down anything and anyone that stood in my way. I asked my sister for an impossible sacrifice. I demanded a part of her body as if it were my right, and when she refused, I saw it as the ultimate betrayal. I had to stop, my vision blurring with tears. I wiped them away and forced myself to read the final lines. But I was wrong. My sister didn't refuse to give me a child. She refused to let me destroy myself in the pursuit of one. She didn't give me her child. She gave me something more. She gave me back myself." I closed the laptop. The silence in my apartment was no longer heavy or cold. It was light. It was peaceful. The question had been answered. I looked out the window at the brilliant, sun-drenched afternoon. I didn't know what our relationship would look like tomorrow or next year. The scars were too deep for a simple return to what we were. But the old pact, the childish promise written in blood, was finally, irrevocably, dissolved. And in its place, I felt the faint, tentative hope that someday we might be able to write a new one, an adult one based not on sacrifice, but on a hard-won and deeply cherished respect.